The house smelled of cold ash and old wool. Isadora Fenmore stood at the window of what had once been her father's study, a room that in better years had held the warm press of pipe smoke and the sound of laughter carried in from the garden. Now it held silence and debt and a letter from the bank that she had read so many times the fold lines had gone soft. She was 26 years old. She had managed Fenmore Hall for 3 years, since her father's hands had begun to shake too badly for him to sign his own name. She had negotiated with creditors in the village, sold the eastern pasture, had let go of 4 of the 7 house staff with letters of genuine gratitude and enough coin to see them through the winter. She had done all of it quietly and methodically, without complaint, because complaint required an audience, and there was no one left to hear it. Snore. The letter on the desk was not the worst she had received. It was simply the most recent. The Fenmore family owed the Hartwell estate a sum that had been growing, with interest, since before Isadora was born. Lord Quist, the current holder of that estate, had sent word that he intended to call upon them. He would arrive Friday. He would bring his solicitor. Her father, when she told him, had simply nodded and gone back to his window. The village of Ashford Crossing knew Lord Quist's name the way it knew the name of winter, not with affection, but with a kind of bracing certainty. He had inherited at 32 and had spent the 7 years since then making it very clear to everyone in the county that sentiment had no place in the management of land. He had consolidated 3 farms into one. He had called in 2 outstanding loans in the same month. He had not, as far as anyone could tell, done anything that was not within his legal right to do. This was, somehow, the most unsettling thing about him. Isadora did not sleep well on Thursday night. She was in the stable yard at 6:30 on Friday morning, not from any particular plan, but because the stable yard was the one place on the property that still felt like it was working. Pen was there, her father's horse, if one could call him, that after the 2 thoroughbreds had been sold. Pen was 19 years old, broad through the chest, with a coat the colour of pewter and the temperament of a man who had long since decided that other people's urgency was not his concern. He had been a plough horse before her father bought him on a sentimental impulse 20 years ago. He had never quite shed the designation. People who came to Fenmore Hall and saw him in the paddock sometimes asked, with barely concealed amusement, whether the family intended to farm him. Isadora rested her hand on the flat of his neck. He did not move. He was the most reliable creature she knew. Lord Quist arrived at 10 o'clock, as his letter had indicated. He came in a carriage that was not ostentatious, but was very clean, which Isadora found almost worse. His solicitor, a thin man named Pruitt, stepped out first and opened a leather case before he had fully descended the carriage steps. Lord Quist himself was taller than she had expected. He wore no particular expression when he looked at the house. Not disdain, not approval. He simply looked the way a man looks at something he is deciding whether to purchase. "Miss Fenmore," said when she met them at the door. "Lord Quist." She did not curtsy. She was on her own step. They met in the sitting room, where Mrs. Oakes, the one remaining housekeeper, had laid out tea that was better than they could strictly afford. Lord Quist sat with the ease of a man accustomed to sitting in rooms that did not belong to him. Spread papers across the low table with a quiet efficiency that Isadora recognized as deliberate, meant to fill the room with the visual weight of numbers. She had already read every document. She had prepared a counter-proposal. She set it on the table without preamble. Lord Quist picked it up. He read it. He did not hurry. "You are proposing a structured repayment across 4 years," he said. "I am," tree, with the eastern meadow held as collateral against the 2nd and 3rd years. The eastern meadow was sold. The northern woodland then. Surveyed last autumn. The timber value is assessed in the appendix. He turned to the appendix. He read it with the same unhurried attention. It made a small sound that might have been surprise. "You had this surveyed yourself?" Lord Quist asked. "I commissioned the survey in October." I anticipated this conversation. He set the document down. He looked at her, not the way men sometimes looked at her, as though calculating how much easier this would be if she were someone's wife, as though he were recalibrating something. "I will need to review this with Pruitt," he said. "Of course." She left them to it. She went to the kitchen, where Mrs. Oakes was pretending not to listen at the wall, and said quietly, "Please put together something for their luncheon, nothing extravagant." Mrs. Oakes had been with the family for 22 years and had an opinion about everything, simply said, "Yes, Miss Isadora," and went to the larder. It was Pruitt who found her, 2 hours later, in the kitchen garden. "Miss Fenmore, Lord Quist would like a word." She followed him back. Lord Quist was standing at the window when she entered, looking out at the paddock, where Pen stood in the thin November sunlight, entirely indifferent to the proceedings. "Your horse," Lord Quist said without turning. "Is that a Plough horse?" "He was. My father bought him when I was 6. He's large." "He is? How old?" 19. There was a pause. Lord Quist turned from the window. "Your proposal is structured reasonably," he said. "I have one condition to add. Hartwell hosts a winter gathering in 3 weeks. A small field trial for horses. Nothing formal. The county families come. I would like your family to attend." She waited. "I want this resolved in a way that does not require further letters," he said. "An afternoon in company, and I will sign the amended schedule." It was an unusual condition. She considered it for 3 seconds and decided that unusual conditions from creditors who had not yet foreclosed were conditions to accept. "We will attend," she said. The field trial at Hartwell was not, it turned out, small in any sense that Isadora would have used the word. There were perhaps 40 guests, which was small for a London gathering and enormous for a county afternoon in November, Italy. The grounds behind Hartwell House had been laid with a low course of obstacles, stone walls, a water crossing, a bank, and the gentlemen of the county were bringing out their horses with the particular self-satisfaction of men who owned very good ones. Isadora's family attended. Her father, Sir Gerald Fenmore, sat in a chair that had been carried out from the house by a footman and wrapped in a wool rug, watching the proceedings with the distant interest of a man reviewing someone else's memories. Her cousin Bertram, who had come down from Edinburgh and who had opinions about everything and knowledge of very little, stood at Gerald's elbow and said things like "quite right" and "well done" at intervals that had no relation to what was happening. Isadora stood to one side, near the paddock rail, and watched. She had not brought Pen. She had not intended to bring Pen, and then, on the morning of the gathering, she had gone to the stable and found him looking at her with that vast grey patience of his, and she had thought it was a foolish thought, and she knew it was foolish, that the old horse would have liked an outing. And so Pen stood now in the paddock at Hartwell, among a collection of glossy thoroughbreds and well-bred hunters, looking like a piece of furniture someone had accidentally left out in the garden. The laughter started with Lord Quist's cousin, a man named Fordyce who had never met a situation he did not feel entitled to comment on. "Good God," Fordyce said, loudly enough to carry pity. "Did someone bring a Plough horse to a field trial?" There was laughter, not cruel laughter, or perhaps it was, and the people laughing had simply convinced themselves that anything said with enough lightness could not be cruel. Lord Quist, standing with a group near the stone wall, turned his head. He looked at Pen. He looked at Isadora. His expression did not change. That was the thing about Lord Quist's expressions. They were not unkind exactly, but they gave nothing away, which could amount to the same thing in company. Isadora did not move from the rail. She was not going to apologize for the horse. She was not going to explain him. She folded her hands on the top rail and watched the other horses warm up. What she had not told Fordyce or anyone was that Pen had, in his youth, been something rather unusual for a Plough horse. Her father had discovered it by accident on a summer afternoon when a fence gate had been left open and Pen had simply gone over it. Not through it, over it, with a kind of easy, unhurried power that had made Gerald Fenmore set down his drink and stare. He had jumped everything on the property after that, not from any training, but from what seemed to be a simple preference for not going around things. He had been jumped carefully over the intervening years, never more than he seemed willing to give, and what he had given had always been more than expected. But she had not said this. It was not the sort of thing one announced. The trial began. The first riders went through the course on horses that had cost more than Isadora's annual household budget, and they went through it well. Clean lines, collected paces, the easy confidence of animals bred for exactly this. Families applauded. Fordyce applauded loudest. Then Thomas Kell, the Fenmore family's former head groom, who had taken a position at a neighboring farm, and who had come today as a guest and stood now at Isadora's shoulder, said very quietly, "You should take him out," she said. "Isadora, Thomas, he can do it. I know he can do it." "Then what's stopping you?" She was silent for a moment. Next horse was going through the course, a chestnut hunter, 17 hands, perfect form. "Pride," she said. "Which kind?" Thomas asked. She did not answer. She was not certain she knew. Thomas Kell had been the Fenmore head groom for 12 years before the economies had made his position impossible to keep. He had trained Pen in the earlier years, not formally, but in the way a man with good instincts and time and genuine affection for an animal trains, by paying attention. He had told Isadora once that Pen was the most honest horse he had ever worked with. "He shows you exactly what he's capable of," Thomas had said. "He doesn't pretend to be more, and he won't pretend to be less. That's rarer than people think." "The course closes in 40 minutes, Thomas said. He said nothing else. Isadora watched 2 more riders. She watched Fordyce's horse, a large dark bay, go through the water crossing with a great deal of noise and drama. She watched Lord Quist's own horse, a fine grey, elegant and clearly expensive, take the stone wall with a foot to spare. Then she went to the paddock and saddled Pen. Conversations nearby did not stop. They simply shifted, quieted, became the particular quality of silence that is a precursor to comment. Fard. She heard Fordyce say something to the man beside him, and did not look up. Pen stood with his usual patience while she tightened the girth. He turned his head once to look at her with that calm pewter eye, as if checking that she was certain. She was. She took him to the start of the course. The course steward, a young man with a clipboard, looked at Pen with the expression of someone deciding whether to say something. He said nothing. He made a mark on his paper. Pen moved into a walk, and then a trot, with the same unhurried quality he brought to everything. Isadora did not push him, did she? She never pushed Pen. Pushing Pen was how you got a horse that had decided not to be interested. She asked him, with her legs and her weight, and Pen listened. The first obstacle was a low stone wall, perhaps 3 feet. Pen jumped it the way he did everything, with a complete absence of fuss. He gathered himself 2 strides out and went over it cleanly, landing softly, already looking for the next thing. She heard the silence change. The brush fence was next, then a turn toward the bank. Pen took the brush fence without hesitation. He took the bank with his characteristic assessment. 2 strides out, a moment of consideration, then an ascent that was so smooth it did not quite look like effort. The descent on the far side was careful, deliberate, to the way a wise horse descends a bank rather than the way a showy horse does. The water crossing. Pen walked into it. This was not a fault. It was Pen being Pen. He walked through it with calm indifference to the cold and the mud and the general inconvenience of water, and came out the other side at a trot, and Isadora felt, through the reins, a quality she had not felt since the eastern pasture was still theirs. Something that was, with some precision, the feeling of being exactly where she was supposed to be. The final obstacle was the widest, a brush and rail combination, requiring both height and scope. She asked. Pen jumped it, not beautifully, not with the trained precision of a competition horse. Pen jumped it the way he did everything, with honesty and sufficiency, with a power that came from his broad chest and his old bones and his long years of being exactly what he was. He cleared it with room to spare and landed, and walked on. That was the end of it. The applause started slowly. It grew. She did not look at Fordyce. She did look at Thomas Kell, who was leaning on the paddock rail, with his arms crossed, and the expression of a man who is trying not to smile and has lost the effort. She walked Pen back toward the paddock. The chestnut hunter from earlier had pulled a tendon on the bank and was being walked in careful circles by its groom. 2 other horses had refused the water crossing. One had stopped altogether at the brush fence, twice, and been retired. 19 years old, and of uncertain breeding, and the color of November sky, had completed the course. Lord Quist met her at the paddock gate. He had walked from the other side of the grounds, and she had not noticed him coming until he was there. He took Pen's bridle in one hand, not commandingly, but in the way of a man who knew horses and did not have to prove it, and the old horse dropped his head slightly and accepted it. "He clears 3 feet 6 easily," Lord Quist said. "More. Yes. He's always done this. He discovered it himself. My father never trained him to it." Lord Quist looked at Pen for a moment. Then he said, with no particular inflection, "Dice has never finished the full course on any horse he's owned." Isadora said nothing. "I want to review the survey of the northern woodland again," Lord Quist said. "Not to dispute it. I want to walk it." She looked at him. "There are 3 parcels adjacent to Hartwell's eastern boundary," he said. "If the timber values hold, there may be an arrangement more useful to both parties than a repayment schedule." He paused. "I would like to discuss it, properly, not with Pruitt in the room." The afternoon had gone gold and cold, the light flattening across the fields. A few guests had moved inside. Her father was being assisted back toward the house by Bertram, who was, for once, doing something useful. "Are you in the habit of renegotiating your own contracts?" she asked. "No," said Lord Quist. "I'm not." He looked at her then, not the calculating look from the sitting room, not the careful neutrality from the window. Something that had not been there before, been there and not shown itself. "Your proposal in October," he said. "You had the woodland surveyed before there was any formal notice of this meeting." "I did, for conversation I had not yet announced." "I prepare for most things," she said. "I noticed," he said quietly, and shifted his weight, patient as always, waiting to be led in. The last of the afternoon's light caught the pewter of his coat and made it, briefly, silver. Lord Quist, Harlan, she would come to think of him, though not yet, not today, handed back the bridle. His hand brushed hers in the exchange. Neither of them moved away. "Thursday," he said. "If you are willing, I'll come to Fenmore Hall. We can walk the woodland before the light goes." "Thursday," she agreed. She led Pen back to the paddock. Behind her, she could hear the county families gathering their things, voices carrying in the cold air, the particular social noise of an afternoon concluding. She did not look back. Pen walked beside her in his slow and steady way, his breath making small clouds in the November air, his large hooves quiet on the frozen ground. He had no opinion, as far as she could tell, on what had just happened. He was interested, she suspected, primarily in whether there was hay. Thomas Kell fell into step beside her. "Well," he said. "Don't," she said. "I wasn't going to say anything." "You were. Stay." "I was going to say that your father would have liked to see that." She thought of Gerald at the window, watching the fields, his hands folded in his lap, his particular stillness that was not peace, but had learned to look like it. "He did see it," she said. "That's right," Thomas said. "It did." She settled Pen in his stall and gave him his hay, and stayed a while in the warm, close air of the stable, listening to the sound of him eating. Outside, the last carriage was leaving Hartwell. Inside, there was the smell of straw and horse, and the faint cold coming through the gaps in the boards. It was not a large thing, what had happened today, to Sen. She knew better than to call it a turning point. She had been turned away from enough of those to distrust the designation, pity. There was still the debt. There was still the letter from the bank. There was still her father's stillness, and the empty rooms, and the economies that had no end in sight. But there was also this, an afternoon in which a horse that everyone had dismissed had gone over every obstacle on a course that had unseated 3 others. There was an old groom leaning on a paddock rail, trying not to smile. There was a man who had come to call in a debt and had instead asked to walk the woodland on Thursday, his Pen eating his hay, unconcerned. Isadora Fenmore walked back to the house in the early dark. The cold had come in fully now, and of cold that meant the first frost before morning. She would check the kitchen garden before she went to bed. She would write a letter to the bank. She would, when Thursday came, walk the northern woodland with Lord Quist, and she would know every tree and survey line and boundary marker, because she had spent the better part of October learning them. She had always been prepared. She had simply, for a long time, been prepared for loss. It occurred to her, at the gate, that she might also learn to be prepared for the other thing. She did not name it yet. But she left the gate unlatched behind her, not from carelessness, but from the small, deliberate act of someone who expects to be coming back.